Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Mike Barajas. I'm a staff writer at the Texas Observer who covers the criminal justice system in the state. We're at a critical moment right now when it comes to the criminal justice system in this country. There's a building bipartisan consensus that our current system of mass incarceration just cannot continue. That this system of harshly and disproportionately policing, punishing, and imprisoning Black and brown and other marginalized groups, that system can't continue. People who have been directly impacted by this system have really valuable stories to share with us. As someone who covers these issues, I believe that listening to them, hearing them, that's what can help us move away from this system that inflicts further damage upon the people that enter it towards something more rooted in healing and restoration. These are the experts that politicians and pundits way too often ignore, and so I'm really excited to be introducing y'all to some of them tonight. I'm also excited to say that we are partnering with the Texas After Violence Project tonight. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with their work, the Texas After Violence Project has for many years been collecting oral histories of people that have been impacted by the criminal justice system as a way to promote and really help cultivate this effort for restorative justice. And so on that note, first up, I'm thrilled to introduce y'all to someone who spent nearly 30 years in prison and has used that experience to push for all kinds of changes. He's an activist, he's a policy advocate with a group called Latino Justice, he's a prison abolitionist, and as y'all are about to hear, a really powerful poet. Please welcome Jorge Antonio Renaud to the mic.
I never knew the name of the woman I left on the floor, bound by her shoelaces. Her face hasn't faded from my memory. It lies shrouded and shaded by the dense darkness of the dusty cells I've inhabited since. Does she remember me? Would she even for a moment care to hear of the violent thuds and howls in a darkened cage, of what led to her debasement, to the tearing of my body and spirit decades before, after I sewed my bloody anus shut and sought revenge on anyone daring to meet my soulless eyes? Would she sit with you tonight? Would her body clench in fury, or would it ease into forgiveness as we together talk on how we got here from there? Does it make a difference if the starting point for the history you will hear tonight is the opening of a curtain or the unlocking of a cage? Does it matter if the testimony tonight is whispered or shouted? If it takes the shape of a murmur or a moan? We are not here to trudge down a road smooth with contrite intentions, bowing to shrill demands that we rehabilitate, as if returning to where we were before would restore the still bodies you will hear about. We are not here to accommodate voices who say we should be grateful for freedom from our past, because where we are cannot be untangled from where we were. The words and memories spoken from this spot, birthed in acts not of our choosing, shaped by forces not of our making. No. We are here to disturb, dismantle, destroy, and kick aside the rubble resting on ground muddied by blood of our blood. The generations of bones cracked by arcing batons, by indifferent fists, by lazy kicks applied by black-booted, blue-suited agents of a system that we will not mollify. The bullets you will hear about tonight didn't just crumble individual corpuscles or still a single heart. They severed fragile familial limbs, and they tore apart the binds that wind through our communities. And pictures tacked to crack walls can never replace those that were shackled and buried into a darkness of the spirit so deep that only the slow sharing of a story steeped in wonder can begin to allow in the light needed for healing. It is not forgiveness we seek. No. It is change we speak to. And change comes one story at a time. testimony after testimony, stanzas dropped into the stillness that inevitably follows the cacophony of the closing cage.
Jorge, everyone. So, I met Maggie Luna earlier this year, or I really got to know her earlier this year when I was covering the Texas legislature when it was in session. Maggie was one of a handful of people who have experienced the state prison system who came to the Capitol to lobby lawmakers, to share their stories, and to testify at committee hearings where, quite frankly, I heard a lot of them called prison officials on some of their half-truths and BS. Maggie, I'm really excited to welcome Maggie to the stage today.
Thank you. Can I? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Maggie Luna, and like Michael said, I met him at the Capitol, but that's not where it begins. In 2017, I was serving time in Plain State Prison, which is a state jail for women. And I remember when I got there, I was like a deer caught in the headlights. I mean, we were all shoved into this cage, fed these peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that were like toast, but not toast because they were toasted, just because they were old. And we were all stripped down naked in front of each other, and we were forced to bend over in front of millions, well, hundreds of women, not millions, but. And it was so humiliating. And then they gave us toiletries and, told us we had to carry our blankets, our pillow, everything from one end of the dorms to the other, which is called Main Street. So I'm walking down Main Street with my mattress and my toiletries, and in front of me there's this old woman. She was 75 years old, which I later learned, and she could barely walk, and she was trying as hard as she could to carry her mattress. And so I ran up to help her, and the officer said, "Get back in line." And he wouldn't let me. I was like, "She needs help." And he said, "Did you help her get here?" So I was forced to watch her for the rest of the way struggle, and it was heartbreaking. And then as I'm doing my time, I was put on blood pressure pills, a water pill, which means I use the restroom a lot. Well, in Plain State Jail, you're only issued one roll of toilet paper every Friday, 2 every other Friday. So if you run out, you run out. And if you have no money on your books, hey. So I had run out of toilet paper, and I went to the guard and said, "Hey, I take these blood pressure pills, and I really, really would like to have some toilet paper." And they had a whole wall of it behind him. And he said, "Ma'am, use your sock. It's not Friday." So, I mean, I didn't even know what to say, so I went back to my dorm like, he just told me to use my sock. And then we would get laundry on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I remember one day I was getting my laundry, and this white uniform was stained between the legs with blood from somebody else. She had bled on it, and they just washed it, obviously not in any bleach. And so I stopped and asked the laundry CO, "Could you please switch these out? I mean, that's somebody else's blood." They said, "Yeah, you get a new set on Friday." I mean, and that's, I couldn't say anything. I had to take it and get a new set on Friday. So December 15, 2017, I was being released from Plain State Jail feeling like an animal. I've done this year of being treated like trash. And so I was so scared to come out into a world that I no longer belonged to. I didn't know what I was going to do. I had a felony. I had no housing. I had know anything. But I was blessed to go into a transitional living where I met Kathy Griffin, who is the the director of human trafficking in Harris County. And she has a group called We've Been There, Done That. So I was attending her recovery groups for formerly incarcerated women and victims of human trafficking. And I met a man named Anthony Graves, who is exoneree number 138. And he had partnered with the ACLU to do this Smart Justice Speakers program for formerly incarcerated people who can impact change in the system. So we took this 12 weeks to learn all about the system. I didn't know how a law was made. I didn't even know, all I knew was what it was like to be in prison. I didn't know what it was like to change laws. But we learned, and Anthony and the ACLU and these people taught us and showed us that our stories matter. So I was released December 15th, 2017. On December 15th, 2018, I was standing in the Capitol preparing to testify in front of the criminal justice system. The Criminal Justice Committee. And it was the greatest feeling. I had just come from prison, treated like an animal, and now I'm standing in the Capitol preparing to talk to these people about my experience. And I told these lawmakers that there are women in there who can't even get a tampon. They're bleeding on their clothes and told that you can't wash them. And when I found out that my voice was heard, there are so many people out there fighting for women that are in there, and it just blew my mind. These people want to hear from us. So I had met a group of people who were working on these women's dignity bills, and they helped us to testify and get these bills, and 8 of them passed. And so, and then a few weeks ago, I was invited to go back to Plain State Jail as a visitor. But this time I got to go home in the same day. So when I was going in the front door, it was so surreal that I wasn't being stripped down naked. I was welcomed in. I got to use the staff bathroom. And that to me was like, I'm a celebrity. But I got to talk to these women, and a few of them I had been incarcerated with before. And I got to tell them, these women who have seen me in whites at the chow hall, I got to tell them I was in the Capitol, and this is what's going on out there. There are people who care about you, and they want to hear what you have to say. And it was just amazing to see these women's faces and to give them hope that if you do something, anything when you get out of here, let them know what happened to you. So, thank you.
Maggie Luna. So our next storyteller, we've been meeting, putting together these stories over the past several weeks, and I've gotten to know her. I had the immense pleasure of getting to know her over the past several weeks. Mignon Zesquo is an activist with a group called Texas Advocates for Justice. She's actually apparently a really talented craftswoman. You can see some of her jewelry over there on the back table. Mignon became an advocate for criminal justice reform because of what she experienced with her sons. And I think her story is a really powerful example of how our system can really further compound trauma rather than help people heal from it. So please help me welcome to the mic, Mignon Zesquo.
Good evening, how y'all doing? Before I became an activist, I was a parent. I was a mom. That was all that mattered to me. I had 3 beautiful sons. My first son, Joseph, was just like his name. He was the firstborn, and he was the strong one of the group. Solomon, my second baby, I didn't know he was coming. I thought he was an immaculate conception. I was working 2 jobs during the week, 1 on the weekend. I didn't remember nothing. But he came. And he was a happy baby. I mean, when he was born, he looked like this old, wise man. And I said, his name is Solomon. His name is Solomon. He was just so peaceful and serene. And my third son, which is Gabriel, he brought up the rear. You know, he was the baby of the family. And but all of the boys had their own special relationship with each other, which of course I didn't really understand all the time, because I didn't understand how they would fight one minute and then be loving on each other the next minute. I didn't understand that. So we had moved out of the neighborhood, and we thought we were into urban living. I got an apartment at a nice complex, I thought, and I had just retired from my job. I had worked for 17 years as a banker, and it was over. It was time for me to go into another direction. So I retired, and we were so excited. I was going to take the family on a family vacation. We had never done that before. And the way that they communicated with each other, we laughed, we joked, we laughed, to sometimes it just hurt because we laughed so much. Well, while we were in this apartment, my oldest son, Joseph, had some interactions with the TDCJ department. He went to jail for a little while, and I was like, okay. He came back home. He wanted to change. Everything was wonderful. Solomon was on his own. He was working with some of his friends, and we decided that we were going to go to college together for 2 years. And we were so excited about that. And I remember the night before we were going to sign up for our classes, he had gone to play some video games with his friends. And I thought that was okay. Y'all just chilling out playing games, okay. So I had noticed these bright lights and things and this helicopter flying around, and I thought, oh, good. The apartment people finally got a hold of the drug traffic that's going back and forth. And I'm seeing all of these red lights and everything. And I said, oh, they got them, okay. I had no idea what was going on. No idea. I remember I went out on my back porch and I saw this ambulance. Didn't have its lights on, no sirens on. The light was on inside of the ambulance, but it silently went out the back door. So I'm okay. Get home. I'm sitting there. I'm watching TV, doing my crochet, and I hear this knock at the door. I look at my watch, and it's about 2:30 in the morning. And I'm like, what is this? So I go to the door, and my oldest son falls through the door. And I catch him, and I'm like, what is wrong with you? And he was like, Solomon's gone, Solomon's gone. I said, gone where? You know, we had something to do in the morning. Where is he gone? He said, he's dead, he's been shot. I think time stood still right then, because I couldn't comprehend what he was saying. That my child had been, my child? As it came through the door, I knew I had to be strong. I couldn't break down right then. We went to the hospital. the nurses at the hospital would not allow me to see his body, which at first I thought was just an excuse that they were giving me. But what I didn't know was that Solomon had been shot point blank with a .357 Magnum in his face. He was trying to duck, and the bullet caught him behind the ear. All of that commotion I had seen was for my son. My son. And I couldn't understand. Time just got away from me right then. And when I got back home, I was furious with that nurse. Why she wouldn't let me see my child? But I didn't understand till later, till after the criminal trial for the person who shot Solomon. When that trial started, then I had a new appreciation for that nurse, because she didn't want me to see what he was then. She wanted me to remember him as my baby. And I appreciated that. The thing about Texas Advocates for Justice, I was a naive mom. I didn't know anything about the social justice process. I didn't know anything about the trial process. I didn't know what questions to ask. And Gabriel had begun to get into a little bit of trouble. And when he was going through the system, I remember distinctly that there's a difference between a court-appointed attorney and a public defender. Remember that. There is a difference between a court-appointed attorney and a public defender. The court-appointed attorney was after their statistics. You got to get this boy to plead, and we're going to send him off to jail, and, you know, it's going to be like that. I kept asking over and over and over again. This lady lied to me and told me that he could finish high school, he could go into the service, he could go to college, he could do this, he could do that. No, he couldn't, because now he had a felony. So Solomon came back home during this process to look after his little brother, because apparently his little brother didn't know the system. When he came back home, they got really close. And that was his brother, that was his father, that was Gabe's everything. His brother was into his life. And all we needed from Gabe was him to go to school and play basketball. That was his job. That's all he had to do. You know, Solomon knew that he was an adult. He had to take on responsibility. He had to help, support the family. All that was good and fine until that night. This happened on a Sunday. That Monday, Gabe had a championship basketball tournament. The way that the apartments are set up, they have those little landings that you can see in between the apartments. Well, this guy was on the side waiting for Solomon and his friend to open up a door. But they didn't want to open up the door because they knew that he was a little bit off. Meanwhile, Gabriel is walking around the apartment complex because he couldn't sleep. He runs into this guy. He shakes his hand, and he tells Gabriel, "Good luck on that game tomorrow." Gabe is good, till he almost gets back to the house and he hears 2 shots. He didn't know what that was about. He just came on into the house, went into his room. He was quiet. So when Joseph, the oldest son, came to the door and he's fallen into my arms, telling me about Solomon's dead, I just couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe that. Where were the cops? Why didn't they come to my door? The people that were in the apartment asked the police to go get his mama. She right over there. This assassination happened in the same apartment complex that we lived in. So if we had security, somebody would have seen this dude. All of it could have been taken care of without any violence. Well, what I found out 6 years later, because Gabriel had a real problem with trauma, and trauma affects the brain. And when you have a teenager who's been traumatized, they need counseling. They do. And it took me 6 years to understand why Gabe kept everything so close to him. And he finally told me that night, when he was walking around, he actually shook hands with the person who murdered his brother. For 6 years, I didn't know any of that. I wrote him a letter letting him know that I did not know where he was that night. I couldn't remember. When he told me what had happened, what had transpired, he kept that to himself for 6 years. And today he's still troubled behind that. Trauma breaks up a whole family. It can. Y'all have to excuse me. Sometimes it's difficult to tell this story because I've told it so many times in so many different ways. Gabriel spent 6 years in prison after this happened. I thought we would be able to get him some help after he came out of prison. But the trauma that sent him to prison, the trauma that he endured while in prison, is too much for him. They apologized to me at the court hearing for not coming to my door. They were just feet away. I remember that I got a sample of the police tape. I remember when they had the little man in the car. But my oldest son is the one who called me 6:30 that morning and told me that they got him. It wasn't a whole great big investigation. That was one person that was looking for the murderer of his brother. And he did that. And he did that. So at this point in time, I'm just hoping that we do make some more communications available for police officers to feel that they are okay with telling someone or telling a relative that something has happened. Not afterwards, not when they get to the courtroom, but when it happens. So as we go through this process, when I learn more, I'll let you all know. Thank you.
Mignon. So prisons are kind of a black box. I can tell you, having covered the Texas prison system, it can be really difficult to see inside, to figure out what's really going on behind bars. And the people who are held there, they have very limited ways of being able to speak out and have their voices heard. And so we're really excited tonight to be partnering with PEN America, who, if y'all don't know who they are, PEN America has been working for decades to amplify the voices of incarcerated writers. And one of them recently has been Thomas Whitaker, who's currently incarcerated in a South Texas prison. Maurice Chama, a journalist with the Marshall Project who covers the death penalty, he's here with us tonight. And he recently worked with PEN and with Thomas to mentor him in his writing, to help edit him. And he's here to tell us a little bit about Thomas and to, with his permission, to read from some of his work. I've known Maurice for a little while. He's a phenomenal reporter and writer. I've really, admired his work for a long time, and I'm really excited to have him up here tonight.
So I drove out to see Thomas about 7 months ago. I went 3 hours east into kind of a rural area where there was this prison. And I had visited prisoners to interview them for articles before. What was different about this day was that I was going on a kind of family visitation day, and I had never been to a prison during family visitation. It was very implanted in my mind now, the image of kind of walking in and just seeing all of these tables of kids and their mothers, and then their incarcerated fathers. The fathers, of course, all wearing white, sitting around these tables and doing puzzles together, playing games, playing with Play-Doh. So I walked through this room and passed it into a second room where higher security inmates are housed and allowed to have visitation. And there, it's the setup that you may have seen in the movies where there's glass and you're on one side of the glass and the prisoner is on the other side, and they have a phone and you have a telephone. And so it's like you're talking on the phone, but you're also looking at them, right? So I sat down, and after a few minutes, the corrections officers brought out Thomas, and I had, was very excited about this because for months I had been working with him on his writing. And even before that, I had known about him. His case is somewhat famous in Texas because he was one of the very, very few people in the last 30, 40 years who have been granted clemency by the governor, Governor Abbott. Hearing all the things that his supporters and even the family of the victims had said about Thomas, decided that he should spare his life. And so Thomas now will live the rest of his life in prison, having averted the death penalty. So I'd been connected with him by PEN America, as Mike said, and the idea was to work on a collection of essays about his experience getting incredibly close to death and then living and, saving his life through this, very complex political and legal process that involved, all these different actors and lawyers trying to find the best legal arguments for him and also the best kind of political way to pressure the state government to save his life and to see that, sort of have the political cover to do that. So given that I knew all this about him, I was surprised actually at how funny a lot of the writing was, that he is writing about the sort of environment, this ecosystem of guys who are living on death row together. In fact, for the last couple months of his life, the last couple months before his execution date, he was living with men in an area called Death Watch, which is where you're housed shortly before execution. And the stories that he was writing in these essays were not nearly as dark as I sort of expected. They were about hanging out, and they had doctored their prison radios so that they could actually talk to each other, and they had turned these radios into walkie-talkies and would have these long, all-night conversations. They would do like show and tell and a version of a game they called Death Row Idol, which was like American Idol, where you would tell a poem or sing a song or something, and they would just sort of like bullshit back and forth about sports, about whatever they were thinking about, and so it was this sort of all night. They called it like the party line, right, from the old days of phones. So he described that, and then I'm going to read a short excerpt right now, and the excerpt itself is very dark, but I want you to know that right before this excerpt, he's describing. And this is crazy, I know this will sound kind of nuts, but they had these fishing lines between the cells, and I had heard of this. You might have seen these in movies, that you can, in a prison, often transfer notes in between the cells on fishing line. But what they had used the fishing line for was to transport food and ingredients. And so one guy would have this one ingredient from the commissary, this other guy would have this other ingredient, and they would trade the food over these fishing lines and make tacos, and then transport the tacos in like little bags on the fishing lines, right? So I just wanted to tell you all that because as dark as this passage is, and as dark as the whole kind of experience is, the whole criminal justice system is, I was really struck by how kind of funny and vivid and like sort of how much humanity and lightness there was in a lot of Thomas's writing. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt. As was our custom, Rabbit and I stayed up after the other guys had gone to sleep, listening to music and working on some letters. A little after midnight, he asked me to turn the volume down. Yeah, I asked, sensing some hesitation in his voice. So, Tuesday. I didn't respond, still waiting on his question to arrive. After a minute or so, he asked, what then? Well, it depends on their vote, I said. I still have my successor writ. I mentioned this not knowing that the Court of Criminal Appeals had already denied this on a fast-track basis. And, of course, my lethal injection challenge in the Supreme Court. If the court agrees to hear the case on the 23rd, I'm assuming that they are going to revive my corpse. That's how this works, right? Ha ha, he gave his best sarcasm-laced imitation laugh. That's not what I mean, though, and I think you know it. That's what they are doing. I'm asking what you are going to do. I knew what he was talking about. Over the years, I had developed an abiding hatred for the execution process. I'm not talking about the dying part. A man can face such a thing with resolve and take some of the sting out of it. Rather, I mean the sort of state power theatrics that are displayed leading up to the final act. There's a lot of pageantry to it, a kind of prideful dance that had initially revolted me and which had only grown more detestable over time. Whatever the warden claimed about not taking pleasure in my death, I've known of many officers who take pride in the act of an execution, treating it as important to their sense of being part of the grand machine of justice, central to their way of being in the world. And given the inescapability of my end, I vastly preferred to meet that event on my own terms. For security reasons, this preference for a last-minute suicide was not one I discussed with many of those close to me. The state hates a suicide while on death watch about as much as I hate the execution two-step, and will do pretty much anything to prevent one if there is even the tiniest suspicion that someone is headed in that direction. I'd given a lot of thought to both the method and the timing over the years. I'd registered with every major organ donor organization in the US and had over a dozen ID cards collected in my cell to prove it. My intention was to make a large sign that read, "I'm an organ donor." I would then tape this under the camera minutes before I self-paroled, with the various ID cards also taped to the relevant parts of my body. The method I'd settled on had no chance of harming any of my organs, and as these things go, shouldn't have been as painful as some of the other few options available to me. Finally, I'd spent the better part of 3 months making a small but significant modification to my cell door. Once a final alteration was made, the guards would have literally had to cut the door off the wall to gain access to the cell. However, the less said about this, the better, save that even steel obeys willpower when enough time is added to the equation. Rabbit knew my stance on this. While he didn't want me to die, he knew how important it was for me to have some kind of volition at the end, to be able to go out in an act of resistance and a denial of Texas's concept of justice.
Maurice Jamal.
So the system that we're talking about tonight, bias and unequal treatment are kind of hallmarks of the system. And a growing body of research shows us how young that starts. There are studies that show black and brown kids are disproportionately arrested, policed, punished at school, suspended. Our last storyteller for the evening, some of you may know him. He's kind of a beloved activist in these spaces. He's going to share a story tonight that he's never publicly told about his first experience with the police state. So please welcome David Johnson.
So it was about 85 degrees on what a Shakespeare fan like myself would like to call a midsummer's day in Chicago, Illinois in the mid-'80s. I was about 9 years old. Now, it might give or take a year, but let's just settle on 9, because I don't know if the numbers are really as important as the story that I remember quite accurately. I had $1. Now I know for a lot of you, heck, I think for all of us today, $1 isn't much. But in the mid-'80s, $1 to a 9-year-old meant the whole world was wide open in front of him or her. And for me, it meant I was going to the corner store, Morgan Foods, with my buddies on the block. Morgan Foods is owned by a couple of lovely immigrants from Jordan named Lee and his wife Linda. Lee thought he was the hippest black dude on the block. Gold chain, taco meat sticking out of the wife beater. Flirted with everyone. That was a woman who walked through the door. Linda put up with Lee's nonsense and made very clear to anyone who came through that store that she was the brains and he was just the face, and that she ran that family. They knew all of us that lived on the block, all of us in the neighborhood, and I ran in with $1. And let me tell you what that $1 meant to me. It meant I could get a 8-ounce barrel juice, a little plastic barrel with this drink that was a refreshing concoction of nothing more than distilled water, food coloring, and sugar. A little foil cap. Snack bag of Doritos, but this is when the snack bag was actually a bag of Doritos, you know, before everything shrank. And with that other 50 cents, I decided I was going to purchase some poppers. No, not the Studio 54 amyl nitrate kind. I wasn't that gone yet. We're talking about these little twisted up things of paper, come in a box filled with sawdust, but these twisted up things of paper have like little rocks with some contact gunpowder. And you throw one in, and that's what you heard. And it was over the counter, and you didn't need a firework license. It was great. And Lee knew me, so I didn't even have to pay tax. It was amazing. I mean, heck, I wish I had food stamps. This was in the day when I think you could use food stamps for that. But I had drink, I had snack, and I had entertainment. So me and my buddies, we ran back onto the block, and it was right across the street from my house. Mom was inside. And there were just these, like my senses, and just talking to you about it now, they're overwhelmed. The smell of that metallic steam that comes off of that cheap pavement that inner cities in the north have everywhere. And all of the sounds, to many who don't appreciate it, it might have been like some chaotic din of worthless noises, but for me, it was a symphony. For me, every child's voice and passing and song from passing vehicle and bus hitting the brakes and then starting up again off 79th Street and the voices of boys and girls and the ice cream trucks, they wove together like individual bits of multicolored oral yarn, weaving this tapestry, this amazing fabric that laid the backdrop for everything we did that day. And cutting through that tapestry was the rhythmic clip-clap of laundry lines used as double dutch ropes. I couldn't double dutch those, so I had my poppers, or some call them snappers. So after I guzzled that juice and chomped down that snack bag that, considering how fast I ate it, I guess wasn't really that big to begin with, I went to my poppers and started throwing them. All 60 pounds of me. I was so engrossed in what I was doing that I had my back to the street and I was facing the porches where kids were sitting, parents in other buildings were sitting watching their kids. Because this was Chicago long before the crime statistics and the headlines and the political corruption. I mean, when I was growing up in Chicago, well, there were crime statistics and headlines and political corruption, but there was community, so that was the big difference. There was community. There was a block club, we had block parties. The neighbors, whether or not they liked each other, we all knew one another. It was awesome. until I heard that moaning screech, or is it screeching moan? Either way, it was the brakes from a police car somewhere behind me. And some might ask how I know this. Well, let me explain for those who are not in the know. There is a familiar sound shared by all law enforcement vehicles when they hit the brakes. And you can tell a lot about a person by their familiarity with that sound. I, black man to be, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I knew that sound well. And I knew that the minute I heard it, I needed to stop what I was doing and turn around and look and see what was happening. And that's when I saw an officer, dark as night, but wearing his blue uniform, get out of the car, get out of the passenger seat of the car. And he said, "You, come here." And I walked over to him, and he started saying things to me in a flurry, and I don't accurately recall exactly what he said, but I know the gist, and he was telling me that I had thrown one of those poppers at his car. Now, please understand that unless I had the ability to throw one so hard and so fast that it in 1 second circumnavigated the globe and came around and hit the car from the other side, it's really impossible for me to do so. However, that wasn't the argument I presented. I simply said, "No, I didn't." And he grabbed me. He wasn't trying to hear what I had to say. And that's when other kids and their parents said, "Hey, he didn't do anything. Leave him alone. He didn't do anything." And he gave him that look that people of color in communities across this country know from police officers and sheriff's deputies and constables. It's a look that says, "Keep talking and this will be you next." So I don't blame him for backing down. But I told him, I said, "Go get my mom. She's right over there. I live right over there." And instead, he threw me in the back of the car and drove me to the police station about 7 blocks away. I did, however, get to yell out to my friends before he closed the door, "Go get my mama," without knowing if they heard me or not. So when we got to the police station, I was taken to this large holding cell, large by the standards that I know now. And I was placed on a slab about 2 inches thick of about 8 inches wide of wood. And I was handcuffed on one wrist and the other cuff was clasped to an anchor bolt in that wood. And this officer, this black officer, who refused to listen to me, who looked so much like uncles and cousins and neighbors, people that I saw at community events, at family reunions. Hell, teachers I had at the predominantly black school I attended, people I'd been raised to trust and turn to. He had betrayed me. I didn't even know if he knew it, but he had betrayed me. And this feeling started welling up inside when he said, "Now, what's your name?" And I don't know if I really knew what it was then. If you asked me, I might have said I was scared or I was hurt, and that was all probably true. But looking back on that moment, I realized I was pissed. I was angry. I look back at that moment, I realized anger is the rawest response we ever have to feeling powerless. And I felt powerless because this person who looked like me before he put on this badge that said I should trust him even more had snatched me away from an amazing day on a block where I felt safe and secure, ignored my pleas to go get my mom, and had locked me in this room while his white partner stood in the doorway and watched, leaning against the door jamb. So when he asked me, "What's your name?" I said the only thing that made sense to a 9-year-old boy raised on amazing sitcoms. I plead the fifth. I thought that sewed that up right there. I plead the fifth. He leaned into my face so close that every detail became almost exaggerated. The shiny, leathery, cocoa-stained skin of his face with all the cracks and crevices that came with his age. His bushy, black, horribly unkempt mustache, and most of all, that stale, noxious, I've been drinking bad coffee breath. As he breathed that steam, that miasma onto me and said, "What did you say?" So here's a little thing about me. I was a nerd, I still am. But I wasn't always 6'3" and 200 plus pounds. I used to be 50 pounds soaking wet with a brick in my hand. And I didn't know how to fight. And I was the guy that if somebody said he talks proper, I would say, oh no, I speak properly. So I got beat up a lot. I got beat up a lot. You know, I was bullied. And that's what this was. It was bullying. And one thing I learned about standing up for myself against bullies, even though it always got worse, is that once you take a stand, you better not stutter, stammer, or stumble when they ask you to repeat what you said. So in the parlance of Las Vegas, I doubled down and said, I plead the fifth. And for added value I threw in, I'm not telling you shit. Fuck you. I think it was somewhere between the fuck and the ooh that a switch flipped within him, but I saw it. His eyes suddenly got flat, and the pupils, I now know the word is dilate, but then I would have just said they got black. It was all black and pink because the blood vessels in the white area around his pupil had all become engorged. And his eyes went from flat to bugged out. And he wrapped his hands around my throat and started squeezing with everything he had. And I tried. Stop was the only thing that would come out of me. I couldn't say I can't breathe. I couldn't even get an extra syllable, just stop. And I knew that if he didn't stop, I was going to die. So I reached way down in my bag of how to keep a bully from beating your ass tricks, and I did the first thing that every kid learns to do when a male is bullying them. And he just happened to be standing perfectly with his legs spread in front of me. As my knee hung right at the bench and my feet dangled without touching the ground, I was able to get some really good back motion, and I swung with everything I had and kicked him square in the jewels. Now again, I told you I'd been bullied in my life. So that should make very clear to you, I've kicked a lot of nuts in my life. Really solid jobs. And young boys are amazingly resilient when it comes to having their testicles tested, shall we say. They'll bounce up and I'm okay. This guy received the greatest Rochambeau I have ever delivered in my life. It was beautiful, solidly connected. As soon as it connected, his hands released me and he fell back. And I saw the eyes, those lovely blue eyes of that white police officer leaning against the door, pop open, and he ran into the room and reached and grabbed his partner just as he lunged toward me and pulled him back and pulled him out of the room. A few moments passed before the white officer returned. And just for note, I wish I didn't have to refer to him as the black officer and the white officer. Unfortunately, the events of that day made their names pretty insignificant to me and everything else pretty clear. But when the white officer returned, he gave me my first dose of the good cop treatment and said, "Hey, look, buddy, we don't want to hurt you. We just want to get you home safe. So why don't you give us your mom's phone number, huh?" I wanted to hold out, but I knew better, and I gave him the number. My mom showed up in what seemed like seconds. I don't know if she was home when to receive that call, but if she was, she would have had to run to the station. I'm of the understanding that my friends actually did honor my last request before leaving the block, and they went and told my mom. And since there was only one police station in our neighborhood, she knew where to go. And she got there, and they uncuffed me and brought me out. And I watched my mom hear these words come from these officers, words that I don't remember because I didn't give a fuck what they were saying. I knew they were lying. I knew they had to lie to explain what they had just done. But I saw the look on my mom's face that seemed like she was listening intently to them and giving them her attention. And that just sat horribly with me, and I just wanted to go. And she asked me to apologize, and I refused. And I walked out, and she came out behind me, and we were walking home from the police station. And I wanted to vent to the one person that my 9-year-old self knew gave a damn. And I was telling her what had happened and venting, and she was eerily quiet until suddenly she lashed out at me in anger. And I didn't understand why. She was mad at me. Why was she mad at me? What had I done? I had been the victim. Why are you mad at me? But again, I was a kid. I was just a kid. I was 9 years old, give or take a year. See, that was long before I was arrested for the first time at the age of 17 by a school district police officer, black officer, who told me to just tell him the truth. And when I told him that I threw one punch to defend myself against a white student, I was taken to jail. I think it has something to do with the fact that that student's mother worked at the school. And it was also long before the first time of many in which I was driving a car with a white female passenger, and the police pulled me over and put me in the back seat without explanation. And then I found out later that they asked the passenger if she was with me willingly or by force. It was long before my first time going to prison at a minimum security private prison facility when an undereducated, underpaid, underqualified white guard lied and said that I assaulted him when I never touched him, ensuring that I went from one outer ring of hell to a very, very well-nourished inner ring of hell at the Ferguson unit in Midway, Texas, and I spent the rest of my entire sentence on high security, getting crash courses in the language of violence so that I would be able to fluently navigate that realm without being a native speaker. It was long before I ever had the courage to bring this day up to my mom and ask her why she was angry with me. And she never said she wasn't angry with me, or she never clarified. But I saw that when I asked her that question, this look of anguish fell upon her face, and she was holding back tears and energy. She was holding them back in her eyes. And the only words she said to me were, "I realized how close I came to losing you." And I thought I knew what that meant. I thought I understood the gravity, the heft, the weight of those words. Because police and Chicago and black and brown bodies and blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't until I became a parent myself and truly appreciated all of the duty and responsibility that comes with that, and all of the hopes and dreams that you have as a parent for your child. It wasn't until then that it became very clear that when I was 9, she wasn't angry at me at all. But I guess it's like I said earlier, anger is just the rawest response we have to feeling powerless.
David Johnson, everyone. Thank you all again for coming out tonight. I also want to give a special thanks to the Judith Miller Foundation that made this night possible. We don't want this conversation to end here. Come up and talk to us. If you have experiences with the criminal justice system, we'd like to hear it. There are all these amazing organizations that have tabled around. Go visit them. They're doing really important work. Thank you all again for coming, and let's thank our storytellers one more time.